Good afternoon. Bill Barrow with the Associated Press, joining you for state funeral services for the 39th United States President, Jimmy Carter. Again, the Carter motorcade has made its way into Washington, and the hearse has stopped with the Carter family on Pennsylvania Avenue. You are seeing images of the horse-drawn caisson that will carry President Carter's flag-draped casket to the U.S. Capitol, where he will lie in state until his state funeral on Thursday morning. This is a part of the presidential state funeral that mixes traditions for all former presidents with unique services reflecting Jimmy Carter specifically. The caisson is something that the nation has seen many times before, but this stop at the U.S. Navy Memorial on Pennsylvania Avenue has particular significance for a few reasons. President Carter was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, finishing in 1946 at the end of World War II. And he launched his Navy career from there with ambitions of climbing the ladder, not of entering politics. He was a submarine officer in the early years of the Cold War. He was, as an engineer, training to be part of the early U.S. nuclear program. And then his father in Plains, Georgia, his beloved hometown of just 700 people, died in 1953, and young Lieutenant Carter moved his family, his wife Rosalind, 3 young sons, back to Georgia, and thus began an entirely different path for Jimmy Carter. He arrived in Washington for his inauguration in 1977, and here on Pennsylvania Avenue created that image that so many people have seen in the years since of leaving his presidential motorcade after being inaugurated as the 39th president to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. He had campaigned on the idea of restoring to the people of the country what he called an imperial presidency. And he viewed that act of walking down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House as a demonstration of a common touch, not governing above the people who had elected him to the nation's highest office. President Carter, like many presidents, and his family were involved for years in planning this state funeral, these many days of observances in his hometown in Atlanta and now in Washington. And this specific portion of today's ceremony is intended as a reflection of that walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. He was inaugurated at the Capitol, walked down Pennsylvania to the White House. In this scenario, his remains under a flag, under the American flag, will be placed on this caisson in front of the United States Navy Memorial and be taken back to the Capitol away from the White House. Again, you're seeing images of the horse-drawn caisson, which is parked in front of the motorcade. The former president's remains have arrived on Pennsylvania Avenue, and we are awaiting this ceremonial transfer from the motorcade to the horse-drawn caisson. So the ceremony we're going to see here, the transfer of President Carter's casket to the caisson, involves many military personnel representing all branches of the United States Armed Services. There is obviously a very heavy Navy presence, with President Carter having been a Naval Academy graduate, a naval officer, and a proud Navy man himself. We see there is a formation of midshipmen from the U.S. Naval Academy, current students who are in the same position that young Jimmy Carter would have been in the early and mid 1940s. The musical support here in the ceremony, you will hear from the U.S. Navy Band. The Secretary of the Navy and the Superintendent of the Naval Academy are in attendance as well to give extra weight to this ceremony. And now we are beginning, so I will let you listen in and watch. We see now the Carter family gathering for the ceremony here at the Navy Memorial on Pennsylvania Avenue. You see at the front of the line, you have all of President Carter's children, Jack, Jeff, and Chip, the three sons who were young adults and worked on his campaign in 1976, part of the famed Peanut Brigade that went from Georgia and spent so much time in Iowa helping the president, the Georgia governor, build a surprise campaign. Also with them is their younger sister, Amy, who was elementary school aged at the time and was seen much more rarely on the campaign trail, but became a very frequent target of news photographers during that campaign, and certainly at the inauguration and during President Carter's 4 years in the White House from 1977 to 1981. We will hear soon from the United States Navy Band. They are expected to play a hymn, Just As I Am, Without One Plea, as the President's casket is moved from the hearse to the caisson. Let's listen in and watch that piece of the ceremony.
Station! Forward! Ready! Go! Stop!
So you're seeing the horse-drawn caisson there carrying the remains of President Jimmy Carter as he makes a last trip to the United States Capitol. This is on Pennsylvania Avenue, about halfway between the White House and the Capitol. It's the same stretch that newly inaugurated Jimmy Carter walked with his family and closest circle on Inauguration Day from the Capitol to the White House. Walking behind, you see his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His sons, Jack, Jeff, and Chip, would have been in their early 20s when he was elected. They were key campaign aides and walked with the President and Mrs. Carter that day. Rosalind Carter died in November 2023. So it is their four children leading the family procession behind their father's casket as it makes its way to the Capitol. This is the view from looking back up Pennsylvania Avenue as the procession starts. This musical performance is the United States Army Band, and they are playing, among many tunes along the way, God Bless America, Flowers of the Forest, and Our Fallen Heroes. That's the United States Army Band playing ahead of President Carter being taken to the United States Capitol. Let's listen in. Yes, we're seeing here multiple representatives of the United States Armed Services. This is a common part of presidential funerals that we see, the pomp and circumstance afforded to those who served as Commander-in-Chief. All branches of the military are represented. Earlier, President Carter's remains stopped at the U.S. Navy Memorial to commemorate his service in the United States Navy and the fact that he is the only graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy to serve as president. But any American president, regardless of their military service, regardless of which branch, if they did serve, would be honored in many of the ways that we are seeing today with processionals with musicians and honor guards and formations representing the United States military that our former presidents once led as Commander-in-Chief. As the processional makes its way up Pennsylvania Avenue, we do see mourners, citizens who have gathered along the street to pay their respects to former President Jimmy Carter. It is a bitterly cold day in Washington, D.C., coming on the back end of a snowstorm that has shut down parts of the city. Obviously, it is fully open for a presidential funeral. These are not massive crowds, but there are people lining the streets paying tribute. We have seen signs, one reading, "The world loves you, President Carter." That is a sentiment that reflects, perhaps most, President Carter's long post-presidency. Jimmy Carter, at 100 years old, was the longest-lived United States president in history. Leaving office almost 44 years ago, he also had the longest post-presidency of anyone who has held the nation's top job. And with that role, he and his late wife, Rosalind Carter, after leaving the White House in 1981, founded and established in 1982 the Carter Center in Atlanta with the mission to with a mission of international diplomacy, mediation, election monitoring, fighting disease in the developing world, and generally advancing and advocating human rights. That work continues. The Carter Center now has about 3,000 employees and contractors across 6 continents. About 300 of those employees are based at the Carter Center in Atlanta, which is on the same campus as the Carter Presidential Library and Museum. Together, that's the Carter Presidential Center, where the former president lay in repose for the last few days before these ceremonies we're seeing today, with his family and his casket arriving in Washington for the nation's capital to pay their respects to the former president. You are seeing here the east front of the United States Capitol, the east steps, military honor guards lining the steps. Military pallbearers will carry the casket of Jimmy Carter up those steps into the rotunda, where he will be received in a ceremony that will include members of Congress and Vice President Kamala Harris. These are the steps where the risers would have been built in 1977 when Jimmy Carter was inaugurated as the 39th U.S. president. This is where presidents were inaugurated for generations before President Carter, but he was the last one to be inaugurated on the Capitol's east side. 4 years later, in 1981, the man who defeated Carter for re-election, Ronald Reagan, opted to be sworn in and address his supporters in the nation from the Capitol's west side. Ronald Reagan was a Californian and wanted to stand, take the oath, and deliver his inaugural address looking out across the National Mall toward his home state of California. But here we see the east side where Jimmy Carter was inaugurated nearly a half century ago as the Georgia governor, Washington outsider, who surprised the establishment in this city by ascending to the nation's highest office. We're again still looking at the East Capitol steps where Jimmy Carter will be carried to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. And this scene and the entire proceedings today in Washington are a chance to take a fresh look at how remarkable it was to see someone like Jimmy Carter become President of the United States. He died December 29th. At the age of 100, he was born a century ago in 1924 in Plains, Georgia, a town in South Georgia in what we call the Roaring '20s, a time that is remembered for a booming economy. But that was not the case in South Georgia and in much of rural America, and certainly not later in his childhood through the Great Depression. Carter was born into a landowning family, relative privilege in the context of his tiny hometown, but with no sort of birthright, no place in the American elite that would have told you that this was a future American president as he came up along the way. He was elected to the state Senate in Georgia in 1962, ran for governor in 1966 and lost, was elected to that office 4 years later. To that point, had never met another United States president. The first president he met was very briefly at the White House when Richard Nixon hosted U.S. governors for a reception. And Carter, as part of his Democratic Party's national campaign in 1972, helped organize what we generally call the coordinated campaign around the country. And in that role, he got to meet several of the Democratic candidates for president running in 1972 and decided that they were no more talented and no more special than he was. And he decided then, with age, to start looking at a presidential run. It was not taken particularly seriously when it was launched. Georgia, now one of the larger, more consequential states in the Union economically, politically, was not in the same place in 1976, late 1974, when he first announced his bid. Even the Atlanta newspaper when Carter announced his bid for the White House, featured some editorial commentary under the headline, "Jimmy Who?" As if to laugh at the idea. His mother, Lillian Carter, laughed at the idea. He would tell the story years later that when he told his mother he was thinking about running for president, her response was, "President of what?" But indeed, Jimmy Carter did win the Democratic nomination. He did win the presidency, defeating Republican Gerald Ford. He ran at a time when the nation was reeling from a hard few decades, from the fallout from the Vietnam War, dissatisfaction with the federal government over that policy, the heels of the civil rights movement and civil unrest and major social changes, and of course the Watergate scandal that had toppled President Nixon and forced his resignation in 1974, elevating Gerald Ford to the presidency. And Carter came in and made being an outsider and being the unknown a political advantage. And he won the nomination that way. And it's worth noting here that campaign, his campaign, the Peanut Brigade that went to Iowa and led other candidates in the caucuses there, is sort of what created the Iowa caucus. I talked to David Axelrod, who was one of the architects of Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, who said, quote, "Jimmy Carter created the Iowa caucus." And indeed, the Iowa caucus for Democrats is no longer necessarily at the front of the process, but Carter created the idea in modern American politics that you do not have to be the presumed frontrunner accepted by the narrative makers in Washington, in national political circles, in national media circles, and you still can become president of the United States. The front of the procession here has reached the grounds of the U.S. Capitol and is approaching the East Front. We see the military band there, and it will not be long before the horse-drawn caisson is stopped in front of those east steps, and we see President Jimmy Carter's remains carried into the rotunda. We see the military formations, the musicians, the honor guard, those presenting arms, or who will present arms, approaching the Capitol as part of the procession the Carter funeral procession. They are on the Capitol's east front, where President Carter's remains will be carried up those east steps into the rotunda. There will be a ceremony there in the rotunda before President Carter begins lying in state later this evening for the public. Members of Congress have been invited to pay their respects. The Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, who was also the Democratic nominee for president, members of Congress, the United States Supreme Court, the mayor of Washington, and governors of the U.S. states, the cabinet, and members of the diplomatic corps, and the Joint Chiefs also were among the list of invitees. We're seeing the Carter family, the motorcade that is carrying the Carter family, approach the Capitol, and they will lead the procession up the steps. A noted absence is former First Lady Rosalind Carter, who died in November of 2023. This is actually the second consecutive presidential funeral in which the deceased president has been a widower. President George H.W. Bush, who was the same age as Jimmy Carter, also outlived his wife, Barbara Bush. So that was another presidential funeral that we did not see the First Lady. Other times we have seen First Ladies surviving their husbands and leading the national mourning and leading these ceremonies. But with his remarkable longevity, living to 100 years of age, Jimmy Carter did outlive Rosalind Carter, his wife of 77 years, the longest marriage of any presidential couple in history. Rosalind Carter died in November 2023 at the age of 96. She had been his best friend, his wife of 77 years, and in their 4 years in Washington, a key political partner and advisor, sitting in cabinet meetings. She expanded the role of the First Lady, establishing an office in the East Wing with the president's blessing, and was a confidant for him privately, an ambassador for him publicly, on the campaign trail, internationally, on trips, and a seamless part of a Carter partnership in politics, climbing the ladder in Georgia, in the United States Capitol City as President and First Lady, and in their many decades after the White House at the Carter Center. But we will not, she died in November of 2023, leaving President Carter to the final chapter of his own life. So we're looking here at the United States Capitol, the military formations in front as we await President Carter's casket being carried up those east steps and into the rotunda for a ceremony scheduled to begin shortly. At that ceremony, we will hear from Vice President Kamala Harris, Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Senator John Thune, and House Speaker Mike Johnson. Members of Congress are invited to that ceremony, as were members of the Supreme Court, governors of the U.S. states, the mayor of Washington, D.C., members of President Joe Biden's cabinet, various members of the diplomatic corps, and also the Joint Chiefs. It's the kind of assembly even beyond what is invited for a State of the Union in the House chamber, and they will be assembled in the Capitol Rotunda for a ceremony accepting President Carter's remains, where they will lie in state for members of the public to pay their respects ahead of a state funeral Thursday morning at Washington National Cathedral.
Family members, Carter family, trailing behind the casket, much like the former president, as he broke with tradition. He got out of the motorcade and walked through Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. His inaugurated, which now made a first trip back to the Capitol. His final trip to Washington, his last trip to Washington.
Honor, George. And shoot.
Yeah. We see the funeral procession, the horse-drawn caisson coming behind the color guard, honor guard there, the clergy, and coming into view the flag-draped casket carrying Jimmy Carter's remains, heading to the Capitol's east front, the east steps, into the rotunda. The
Honor, guard. Attention! step. Ready, 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 step. Forward, march.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms have bound the restless waves, we thank you for the inspiration of a consequential and laudable life as we celebrate the legacy of James Earl Carter, Jr., the 39th President of the United States. We proclaim your generosity to this nation and world for giving us the gift of someone with the ethical congruence to be salt and light to his generation. Lord, he made the world more palatable. We thank you for his passion for integrity, his commitment to leave the world better than he found it, and his exemplary love for his precious Rosalind. Inspired by his great life, teach us to know you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. We pray in your matchless name. Amen.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and other members of the Carter family, and distinguished guests. Today we gather to begin a final farewell to Jimmy Carter, Navy veteran, peanut farmer, Governor of Georgia, and President of the United States. Sunday school teacher, Nobel Prize winner, advocate for peace and human rights, and first and foremost, a faithful servant of his Creator and his fellow man. In a commencement speech he delivered at Liberty University back in 2018, President Carter told a story about going on a mission to Massachusetts back in his younger days under the auspices of the Southern Baptist Convention. During that trip, President Carter was impressed by the success of a fellow missionary in winning souls to Christ. And so as the mission was winding down, he asked him what made him so successful. He was a little embarrassed by my question, President Carter recalled, but then he finally said, I try to have two loves in my heart. One love is for God, and the other love I have in my heart is for the person who happens to be in front of me at any particular time. It was a statement, President Carter said, that he never forgot. And I think it's fair to say that it's also a statement he lived by. President Carter's term as president ended in 1981. And for the remainder of his life, the longest post-presidency of any American president ever, he focused on making the lives of his fellow man better. That meant things like the Carter Center, which among other things works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. And it meant things like his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And when I say his work with Habitat for Humanity, I do mean his work. Jimmy Carter knew that his status as a former president could bring attention to good causes. It's why he encouraged Habitat to make use of his name and image. But simply lending his name, or maybe attending a gala or two, wasn't Jimmy Carter's style. He was here to get down in the weeds and the dirt And he did that literally on numerous habitat builds, including one back in 1994 in Eagle Butte in my home state of South Dakota. Well into his 90s, he could be found with his hard hat and tools on construction sites doing the practical work required to get families into homes. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jimmy Carter did his very best to live according to the calling of his Lord and Savior. Today, I join all Americans in mourning President Carter and remembering his example. But I rejoice in the thought that he, together with his beloved wife, Rosalind, is now before the face of his Father.
To the family, to Jack and Chip and Jeff and Amy, the entire Carter family, Vice President Harris, members of the Cabinet, Leader Thune, my colleagues in Congress, and my fellow citizens. We meet in this sacred hall of self-government to honor an extraordinary man, a man who modeled the virtues of service and citizenship, as well as any other American. Surrounding us are the statues of those who gave their time, their energy, and their lives for the good of America. Before us lays a man who now joins their midst as a patriot, a veteran, a humanitarian, and the 39th President of the United States. When Jimmy Carter walked out on the east front of the Capitol and took his oath of office, I was just 4 years old, and he's the first president that I remember. Looking back, it's obvious now to me as an adult why he captured everyone's attention. Jimmy Carter was a member of the greatest generation. He lived through the Great Depression. He did that on a farm in rural Georgia. He knew the value of a dollar, and he modeled thrift his entire life. As long as he was in office, he hated government waste. His father, an Army veteran of the World War I era, taught patriotism to his children. And eventually his son, this young man from Plains, followed his father's example of self-sacrifice, and he joined the Naval Academy in the middle of World War II. In the Army, Lieutenant Carter learned from the legendary Admiral Rickover to always do his best as he served on the first fleet of nuclear submarines. It's telling that today the USS Jimmy Carter, a top-secret attack submarine, now roams the oceans, bearing the name of the only president who served in such close quarters. President Carter's life, his selfless service, his fight against cancer, and his lasting contributions to his fellow man are all truly remarkable. Whether he was in the White House or in his post-presidential years, as was discussed, President Carter was willing to roll up his own sleeves to serve and get the job done. We all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, and that was mentioned. And the origin story goes that it was in 1984, when he first became aware of the work. He was in New York for a friend's anniversary. Millard Fuller, the founder of the fledgling charity at the time, called President Carter and asked if he wanted to visit a site in Brooklyn during his trip. President Carter agreed, and he found his way down to the Lower East Side. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, he looked out on the wealth of Wall Street to the south and to the power of Midtown Manhattan to the north. And then he looked down and he saw an image he'd never forget. An elderly woman cooking breakfast over an open fire in the rubble of the building, there in the heart of the richest city in the world. The Habitat for Humanity worker that was there with him turned to President Carter and said, if there's anything that you can do, we would take it. He said, if there's anything I can do, let me know. The worker said, well, maybe you can send some volunteer carpenters from your church. It was the very next day that President Carter called Habitat for Humanity and told them he was going to send some carpenters, all right, and that he himself would be one of them. And thus began his famous tradition of donating 1 week every year to build and restore homes for his fellow Americans. It's remarkable to think that one of the 45 men who has served as president and one of the only 13 who held the role in the nuclear age would humble himself to such service. We all know that his care for humanity didn't stop at building homes. In the face of illness, President Jimmy Carter brought life-saving medicine. In the face of conflict, he brokered peace. In the face of discrimination, he reminded us that we are all made in the image of God. And if you were to ask him why he did it all, he would likely point to his faith. I'm reminded of his admonition to, quote, live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon, and of his amazing personal reflection. Quote, if I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. We all agree that he certainly did. So today in these hallowed halls of our republic, we honor President Carter, his family, and his enduring legacy that he leaves, not only upon this nation, but upon the world.
Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, members of Congress, and distinguished guests. It is an honor to be with you this afternoon, and to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and Jason, and all the other members of the Carter family. On behalf of the American people, Doug and I offer our deepest condolences. Being with you today, I'm reminded of the enduring words of a favorite hymn. May the works I have done speak for me. Today we gather to celebrate the life of a man whose works will echo for generations to come. A man from Plains, Georgia, who grew up without electricity or running water, and served as the 39th President of the United States of America, and lived every day of his long life in service to the people. President James Earl Carter, Jr. So I was in middle school when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and I vividly recall how my mother admired him, how much she admired his strength of character, his honesty, his integrity, his work ethic and determination, his intelligence, and his generosity of spirit. We have heard much today and in recent days about President Carter's impact in the 4 decades after he left the White House. Rightly so. Jimmy Carter established a new model for what it means to be a former president, and leaves an extraordinary post-presidential legacy. From founding the Carter Center, which has helped advance global human rights and alleviate human suffering, to his public health work in Latin America and Africa, to his tireless advocacy for peace and democracy around the globe. And Jimmy Carter was a president of the United States who was ahead of his time. He was the first president of the United States to have a comprehensive energy policy, including providing some of the first federal support for clean energy. He also passed over a dozen major pieces of legislation regarding environmental protection, and more than doubled the size of America's national parks, including protecting our beloved redwoods in my home state of California. He was a president who, between the years of 1977 and 1981, appointed more Black Americans to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined, and appointed 5 times as many women. And in the wake of Watergate, Jimmy Carter passed historic ethics legislation to help rebuild America's faith in government. Jimmy Carter, as president, was also a respected global leader. To be sure, the years of his presidency were not without international crises or challenges, but his legacy of global leadership is well established. In Asia, he instituted full diplomatic relations with China, which he would later call one of the most historically significant accomplishments of his presidency. And his legacy lives on in the Middle East because, do recall, in the decades before Jimmy Carter became president, Israel and Egypt had been at war numerous times. Few thought peace could be achieved between them. Yet Jimmy Carter did that. Through his persistence and perseverance, through his unshakable belief in the power of American diplomacy, he secured the Camp David Accords, one of the most significant and durable peace treaties since World War II. And throughout the world, Jimmy Carter elevated the role of human rights in America's foreign policy priorities and uplifted the importance of civil society in doing that work. Jimmy Carter was a forward-looking president with a vision for the future. Consider his establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977, which anticipated the central role it would play in addressing the climate crisis. His creation of FEMA in 1979, which enabled our nation to mobilize a national response to disasters, which has helped countless communities rebuild and recover. And his founding of the Department of Education later that year, which elevated public education institutions and increased national standards for the education of America's children and future leaders. Jimmy Carter was that all too rare example of a gifted man who also walks with humility, modesty, and grace. Recall the stories from the 1976 campaign about how he slept in the homes of his supporters to share a meal with them at their table and to listen to what was on their minds. How on their first trip for Habitat for Humanity, Jimmy and Rosalind rode the bus with the other volunteers. And when the group stopped for the night to stay at a local church, Jimmy and Rosalind gave their private room to a young couple who had put off their honeymoon to join the trip. And with the other volunteers, they then slept on the floor of the church basement. And then, of course, his work to eradicate the vicious guinea worm disease that once disabled millions of people a year. It was one of the Carter Center's greatest triumphs. And Jimmy Carter, of course, given his nature, attributed its success not to his own leadership, but to the thousands of everyday Africans who were on the ground doing the work. Throughout his life and career, Jimmy Carter retained a fundamental decency and humility. James Earl Carter Jr. loved our country. He lived his faith, he served the people, and he left the world better than he found it. And in the end, Jimmy Carter's work and those works speak for him, louder than any tribute we can offer. May his life be a lesson for the ages and a beacon for the future. May God bless President Jimmy Carter, and may God bless the United States of America.
My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride, from every mountain side let freedom ring. My native country, the land of the noble free, thy name I love, thy name I love, thy rocks and rills, thy woods and templed hills. My heart with rapture thrills like that above. Where Tuesday swell the breeze and bring from all the trees sweet freedom's song. Our fathers call to thee, liberty, to thee we sing, sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God our King. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride, from every mountain side let freedom ring.
Would you pray with me? Holy and loving God, receive into your eternal joy your good and faithful servant, James Earl Carter, Jr. Reward him richly and grant him your own well done for his humble and honorable life, worth far more than the many accolades and attributions we have gladly given. May President Jimmy Carter now rest from his labors and be received into the embrace of your everlasting arms. And when the ceremony and fanfare due this man of character and compassion fades into history, when the processions and parades have dispersed, leave with us, O God, the lasting impression and inspiration of a life well lived. Ignite in us the same passion for public service, the courage to champion the underserved, the strength to bear as faithfully the weight of the call to which you have called each one of us, to do as justly, to love mercy as unreservedly, to walk as humbly with you as we have witnessed in the testimony of President Jimmy Carter's life of faithfulness. We offer our prayers in the name of the one whom Jimmy Carter would have known to be the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, his rock and our Redeemer. Amen.